This came out of the wall of a New Zealand house, and from the driveway, the house looked fine, but there are around 42,000 homes where water could be quietly seeping inside and rotting the walls. And the bill to fix them, $11 billion in total. But these are the 7 signs that you can look for to see if you're standing in front of a bad house. And today we're going to count these down from the easiest spot to what could possibly be the costliest financial mistake of your life.
A lot of these you actually can do in about 60 seconds or so if you get yourself in the right place. Andrew, what is number 7?
So number 7, I'm going to go with, does the house move? So look.
What do you mean?
Now, does it jump around? Does it move around the site? Have you seen that thing on YouTube or TikTok at the moment where some guy's obsessed that a tree's moving closer to his house?
No.
Forget about it then. So look, you're looking for cracks in the walls or the ceilings. Wider than kind of 5 millimeters.
Do you find that whenever you talk, anybody says a centimeter, you find yourself
always that.
You pull up your thumb and your index finger,
right size
and you're like, oh yeah. But so cracks.
What happens when people say inches?
Oh, that's 2.5 centimeters. So then I go bigger. But it's funny, whenever somebody says, 6 inches, I'm like, how big is it? Can I say that?
No.
Can I say that?
Floor. So 5 millimeters. Now, floors that slope or bounce as you walk, or if you put a marble on the floor and you see it racing to the other side of the house, that's probably a sign that there's been a bit of movement in the house.
Okay, so we're going to walk around the house looking for cracks, because I know that if it's a hairline crack, it's probably not going to worry you too much. But if it's wider than your 5 millimeters, that probably would be a bit of a concern. Have you actually ever walked into an open home with some marbles in your pocket and put it on the floor?
I'd lost my marbles if I did that. I mean, buying lots of earthquake damaged houses post-quakes in Christchurch, you were looking for these things. Now, back then, it was definitely a bit of showmanship to get a good deal. So, of course, you would take things to try and make it look more catastrophic than it was. That's just the truth. But the reality is, in a normal purchase, like if I'm going to buy a property now, when I bought my house to live in, we didn't walk around with marbles or anything like that. And you do get a good feel for it. Like, at least I've had a few drinks at lunch, I can usually get a pretty good feel walking from one side of the house to the other, whether or not you've got any meaningful amount of drop. Now, again, old houses probably do have a little bit of movement, and some of it's going to be harmless, like clay soil, that does move. But it could also just mean that the foundations are absolutely munted and your piles are gone, so it could be insignificant or really significant. And I've got a team of people who sole job is to go around looking for good quality investment properties. And one of the things that they said to me is when you're looking at walls, you want to check for big bows or bulges. That's the number one thing that something's not right and you want to probably investigate a bit more.
Okay, interesting. Number 6 I want to put on here is to use your nose a bit and just look for damp and mold. So you can walk in and take a bit of a deep breath, and if there's a musty or damp smell, that could be a bit of a giveaway. The other thing you sometimes look at, especially on the ceiling, if we're looking for any dark patches or spots, if any water's got through. I remember talking to one homeowner, and they were sitting in their lounge one day and they looked up and they was like, oh, there's a little bit of a spot there. And it was almost like, they described it to me as if somebody had taken a tea bag and just went boop on the roof, right? Boop. And what they found out was their shower on the second story had been leaking. And if they had left it long enough, it could have actually collapsed. And imagine that standing in your shower and then all of a sudden you're standing in your living room. Imagine
if
that.
If you remind me, I've got a good story about that later, not for the podcast. And one thing actually that I've noticed, I went to an open home the other day with one of our team members, and when we arrived, the agent had already put on the pallet fire, and I thought, oh, that's a nice
The pallet
idea.
phone.
The pallet fire.
Fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't even click to this. And when we left, my friend Stevie said, that's because this house will be as cold as charity. And she's right. There's no good reason an agent's that organised to get there, because it was just a private viewing, that they would turn on the fire in advance. They must be like, holy hell, we need to make sure this is warm because it was a cold day.
Okay. And was it single glazed?
Yeah. It was retrospectively double glazed, so not as efficient, but just a big cold old house.
Okay, interesting. But one thing we know is that about 20%, 1 in 5 New Zealanders are currently living in damp dwellings. Now, the good news is that number's going down, but there are a lot of houses out there that are a bit damp, so we can look for like little water stains, bubbling paint on the ceilings or walls, maybe any black spotting in corners. Hopefully, if the real estate agent is any good, they would have got rid of that already. But because so many New Zealanders do live in what are considered damp homes, we've just got to be looking out for that, because it's so easy when you go into an open home or looking at a property, you get so wound up. You're caught up in the moment. You're dreaming about your perfect life or your perfect investment property and how much tenants are going to love that property or you're going to love living in it. And you forget to open and close the windows and make sure that they all work and really dig into it. But that brings us to number 5.
Number 5 is look at the layout. And I think even with newer homes where you're thinking, okay, surely a developer is going to design this in such a way that's efficient, because, you know, we're more used to open plan livings and not having, you know, hallways with like pokey rooms coming off them, like what we might have, you know, had growing up. Not saying that, Ellie, that's what you've done.
Not my mother. I got in trouble in the past when you said that we didn't live in nice homes, and she called me up and said, Edward, you always make me sound like a bad mother on this show. I provided a good home, and she did.
Yeah,
so
mine,
didn't.
on the other hand, we like some of the layouts were just poorly designed, and you think that, okay, developers, you know, they're going to be efficient with the space. Not always. So I'll give you an example. So my team were looking at some properties, and the numbers looked great, and they were an appropriate size. But because the developer tried to cram more into the site than perhaps would be optimum for kind of livability, when you actually went through the property, there was a washing machine plumbed in right by the front door. Now, some people might be okay with that, but imagine how many people would be put off if you're trying to watch, I don't know, what are you watching? The Sopranos reruns.
I'm watching Schitt's Creek at the moment.
Oh, yeah, Schitt's Creek's another good show. And all of a sudden you hear the as the spin cycle comes on the washing machine.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
Imagine that during chores.
I can't even handle like the dishwasher humming in the background. That would send me around the bend. And like another good example of that site, you go into another unit and there was a toilet coming straight off the kitchen. That's disgusting to me. Now, some people, again, might be completely fine with that. But for the vast majority, you'd be looking, oh, I don't want to live in that. Well, I don't want to buy that property because of such a small detail, but it has quite a meaningful impact on the livability.
Yeah, so maybe something not to recommend to investors.
Schitt's Creek, Schitt's Kitchen, more like.
At number 4, I'm going to put in whether the property is legal or not. So often in New Zealand, people might build decks or extra rooms, or they might have moved plumbing because we're quite DIY, and sometimes people cut corners because their mate's a plumber. Not to say that a plumber would ever cut corners, but some properties do have work that is actually quite illegal. And so what you're going to want to do is check the land information memorandum. This is the LIM report, the council file that has all of the details about what is actually being consented. Now, you don't have to go through this yourself, but what can take you 60 seconds is saying to your lawyer, I want you to go through the LIM report and tell me anything that I should be concerned about in there. That can take you 60 seconds while they actually go away and do the work. Because if you find out that there has been some renovations done without consent, that could void your insurance. It could block you from getting any bank lending if they can find out. And the truth of the matter is fixing the paperwork isn't that simple. Like with Auckland Council, if you want to go in and get what's called a certificate of acceptance, so if the work hasn't been done and you've got to pay for it, like it could cost you anywhere from $1,400 to $2,400. Like it ain't cheap to just get it signed off. One thing you could do if you were buying an existing home and you realized that there was unconsented work is you could make your offer subject to the current owner going away and getting it all signed off by council. Have you seen people do things like that in the past?
Yeah, 100%. And I would do that rather than take on the liability myself, unless I was getting a huge discount, because if something goes wrong and you can't get it signed off, then you're left with a defective property. And like it is a real risk around the insurance side of things. Like you could say, I know that there are people out there that will just ring Tower and say, right, I'm just picking Tower just by random, and saying, I want to insure this property. And they'll just leave out some of the details that they know. Now, if there's a major claim, you've got what Tony Mounts would call a Clayton's policy. So Clayton's was a drink back in like the old days where it had no alcohol in it. So it was a drink, but it wasn't a drink. Like you'll have a policy issued, but it's never going to pay out. It's never going to do what you think it's going to do. And so I think that's really important to remember. You can't cheat your way out of complying with these compliance issues.
And I think what a lot of people don't realise is you can make offers subject to the vendor changing something or doing some work to the property. Now, could you do all of these checks in 60 seconds? Not all 7 checks, but each one could take you 60 seconds to have a quick open of some of the windows and checking the driveway and pulling your marble out and putting it on the floor.
Maybe spend a bit more than 60 seconds. I mean, it's great 60 seconds, but imagine running around the house, throwing marbles, opening things.
Oh, that would be a really good social media video. We're going to have to do that. But that brings us to number 3.
And that's assessing whether or not the spec is appropriate for what you want to use the property for. So think from an investor standpoint, right? An investor, you might pay for a few of those higher end fittings that a tenant is not going to pay any more rent for, or they might pay like another $5 rent, or well, probably not, let's face it. And the great examples are like a designer bench top. The number of times I've heard people talk about like the bench tops in the kitchens and all those kind of things, it's not going to move the dial from a financial aspect. So I kind of think, well, if you're going to pay more for these things and a tenant's not going to pay more for it, and then you're going to end up paying more in maintenance because it costs more to maintain those type of things, well, you're just over-capitalising for someone else's benefit that you're not going to see a financial return on. And then when you sell the property in 20 years' time, all that stuff needs to be replaced anyway.
Yeah, I was speaking to an investor who was talking about bench tops, and they were saying that when they're renovating, especially if it's like a more affordable property, they will just put in stainless steel bench tops, like the ones that you used to see in good old state houses. And they're like, the truth of the matter is the tenants can then thrash the stainless steel bench top. It ain't going to make it, like it's got to hold up. And then if I want to sell it at the end, I rip it out 15 years later, replace it with something new that a homeowner might want. And actually that's what we're going to go for. And so whenever I see an investor interested in a property that has the word luxury anywhere around it, I'm like, oh no, that's like one of my red flag words. I'm like, I don't want to be buying a luxury investment property. Like I want to invest in property so maybe one day I might be able to afford a luxury property. That might be quite nice, but that's not the sort of spec or quality level that's going to be appropriate for a tenant, because tenants, the number one thing they care about is whether the property is affordable. So my incentive is to buy an affordable property for them.
I think that people get so caught up applying what they want to what an investor wants or what makes a good investment. Because any property can be a rental property. It doesn't mean it's a good investment. And that's probably the quiet value of having a team behind you, whether you use a company like Opes or you build your own team. And if I think back to, again, kind of some of that knowledge that you gain over years and years of investing, on a recent project, our property team made more than 35 changes on a developer's plans. So the developer came with this concept. We said, actually, there's some stuff here that we know will really affect the livability and rentability of these properties. And they're all minor things, but put together, it really changed the project from being okay to being really appropriate.
That poor developer who's like got all of their hopes and dreams, bringing in their plans.
Get some sold, because developers buy into this stuff as well. They think they know what an investor wants or a tenant wants. And fixing the layouts, that's something that's great that if you've got some scale you can do. But if you're an individual buyer going in there, Mike Greer's going to probably tell you to bugger off.
If I think about number 2 on our list of the signs, the 7 signs of a bad house that you can spot in 60 seconds, it's going to be a strange one, but like checking what the house actually is. I'll give you a really good example.
Oh, I've bought a mouse house again.
No, that's not what I mean. But like there are properties being sold right now as new builds, and developers say, oh yeah, this is a new property. But legally, it's not a new build. Now, one of the benefits of buying a new build is 20% deposits. You don't have to follow the debt to income ratio rules because it's all exempt from the Reserve Bank's restrictions. Really good benefit. But the definition of a new build by the Reserve Bank is whether the code compliance certificate has been issued within the last 6 months. Now, there is a property that I know that's currently being sold by a developer because I wrote about it in our book Wealth Plan, which is behind you, which we released probably about 3 years ago. And I remember talking about this property and how it wasn't selling in that book. It's still not sold
What?
It's not sold.
I know the one you're talking about.
3 years later. It's because the developer's using it as an Airbnb.
Because it was in the book.
But my point here is, like, if you just thought, oh, it's a new house, yes, but it's not technically a new build for the purposes of the Reserve Bank's regulations. So actually, you're going to need a 30% deposit. You're going to need to follow the Reserve Bank's rules there. The other thing that I often look at is, well, what's actually the title? I don't think people dig in enough to understand, well, what is the difference between a fee simple or freehold title, which is the type of land that you're purchasing, versus a cross lease, versus a leasehold, versus a unit title. These have very specific legal definitions about what you can and cannot do with the land, and it actually is somewhat evolving over time. We talked recently on the podcast about a decision coming out of the courts that's going to impact and set a new precedent for cross-lease properties. That's really exciting. Go back and listen to that one. But really understanding, what is the house you're buying? Is it a new build? Is it existing? Is it legally a new build? Is it a freehold? Is it a leasehold? And understanding what that actually means, you should dig into this. If you are buying a new build, ask what date was the code compliance certificate issued? That's going to impact how much deposit you actually need. And it's one of those traps that investors often don't look out for.
And number one is smooth monolithic or plaster cladding on a home built in kind of the 1990s to early 2000s. Now, these are what we know as leaky homes. And my honest advice when it comes to these type of things, if it's not leaking today, it will be leaky in the future. And I've known people who have been devastated financially over these type of investments or these type of properties, be it owner-occupied or as an investment. In fact, just last week, I had an investor, I think a listener of the show write into us saying, hey, I've bought this property, got a really good deal, massively under what it should be worth. I'm going to go and conduct this massive renovation to change it from being a leaky property. And my summary email to him was, don't do that. And there are so many people who have bought these properties because they look nice, but underneath that plaster cladding, there's untreated timber, and as soon as water gets in there, you end up rotting that structural integrity of the property. And later on down the track, you either have something you're going to have to tear down or something you're going to have to put some major money into repairs. And unless you are a highly experienced builder that can actually deal with this yourself, I wouldn't even touch these with the barge pole.
I actually created you a bit of a visualization to have a look at what actually happens, because it can be quite hard to understand, like, what caused these properties to be leaky. And the issue was that plaster can easily crack, especially when the paint chips, and also plaster is porous. So if water touches it, it can travel through, just like bricks. But the issue was that the plaster was right up against the untreated timber underneath. So it's touching it. And then a couple of months later, it appears as that little tea bag stain at the start. Right on your walls, because the water's getting trapped in there and can't move. And so what you've got to do, and the way that we've been building homes since 2004 or so, is that there's what's called a cavity. There's just a gap, so that when the water gets through the plaster, it drains out and just goes out the bottom. That's why one of the other things you need to check is whether the gardens are right up against your property, because if you find that the gardens are right up against the external walls of the property, there may be an issue where the water's not able to leak out as well. That's another, there we go, bonus number 8, what you can look out for as well.
So now you know the 7 signs to spot a bad house, from the cracks to the cladding, but spotting a bad building is only half the job. One buyer bought a house for $1.9 million and later resold it, losing $800,000. So before you sign a contract to buy a house, make sure you watch this next video where I break down the 7 signs you're buying the wrong property. Click the video on screen and watch it now.